Well, thank you everyone for using your lunchtime to join us today for today's webinar. My name is Elva. I work for the Klamath Bird Observatory, and I'm a part of the eBird Northwest Steering Committee. And we're very excited to have Dr. Olivia Sanderfoot with us today to talk about an amazing community science project called Project Phoenix. Go ahead and take it away, Olivia.
Wonderful. Can you all hear me okay? Fabulous. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for taking time out of your busy Friday afternoon to learn more about our program. This is such a cool idea to have a webinar all about birds over lunch. I just love it. So I'm happy to participate. So today I will be presenting on Project Phoenix, which is a new regional community science program taking place in Washington, Oregon, and California. And I'll also be telling you a bit more about my research here at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, where I'm focused on engaging the public to unravel the mystery of how birds respond to wildfire smoke in the American West. Here is an outline for the topics that I hope to cover in today's webinar. First, we'll talk about how wildfire smoke is an increasing stressor to birds and other wildlife, as well as people. We'll look at the literature and think about what we know and what we don't know so far about wildfire smoke impacts on birds. Then we'll dive into some of my recent research looking into how wildfire smoke influences our observations of birds and the probability of detecting birds in the field. And finally, we'll get to the main event and talk about Project Phoenix, investigating bird responses to smoke. So without further ado, let's dive right in. As I'm sure most folks on this call are well aware, birds face myriad threats, from urbanization to climate change, from invasive species to overexploitation, human-wildlife conflict, and pollution of soil and waterways. But air pollution is also a known risk to birds, and despite this, air quality is often overlooked in conservation biology and wildlife management. And I find this just utterly fascinating because we've known for over a century that birds are more sensitive to air pollution than we are. In fact, in the early 1900s, coal miners would bring canaries down into the mines with them to help monitor levels of noxious gases, such as carbon monoxide. And this practice led to the use of the common colloquial phrase, canary in the coal mine, to refer to an early warning signal of some future danger. So over 100 years ago, we already knew that birds were valuable sentinel species for environmental health and specifically air pollution. We've known quite literally for decades that birds are inherently more vulnerable to air pollution than we are. And yet, we just don't know that much about how air pollution is impacting wild birds. So why is it that birds are so much more vulnerable to air pollution than we are? Birds have an incredibly efficient respiratory system. And this allows them to get enough oxygen to take flight, swim hard, and fly at high altitudes. Their unique respiratory physiology allows them to extract more oxygen with each breath than all other air-breathing vertebrates. And one key feature of their respiratory system that supports this efficiency is unidirectional airflow, which is shown in this animation here. So at the top, you can see an animation of how we as humans and other mammals breathe. When we take a deep breath, our lungs expand and we pull in fresh oxygenated air. And when we breathe out, our lungs contract and we expel the air that we've already extracted the oxygen out of. As you can see in the bottom panel, which shows avian respiration, this isn't how birds breathe at all. Birds use a system of air sacs to constantly push fresh air into their lungs. This happens in a four-step cycle that creates a single continuous loop. And if you have more questions about this in the Q&A, I'm happy to geek out with you over this very cool physiological adaptation that birds have. In addition to unidirectional airflow, birds also have a very thin blood gas barrier, which helps them to get more oxygen out of the air that they breathe. And they have cross-current gas exchange, which also helps them just be super efficient at extracting oxygen from each breath. In addition to this super efficient respiration, birds also have tightly intertwined air and blood capillaries in their respiratory system, which makes them more vulnerable to the particulates that are present in the air as well. And birds seem to lack a lot of the mechanisms that mammals have, such as an effective cough to clear particles from their airway. So whether we're talking about gaseous air pollutants or particulate air pollutants, birds are just inherently more vulnerable to any toxins in the air that they breathe. But We don't know that much about how inhalation exposure to these toxic gases and aerosols ultimately affects the health and behavior of birds. There really is just limited research out there to tell us about how we can expect these individual effects of air pollution on avian health to scale up to population level impacts. We don't know what the demographic consequences look like. As part of my master's thesis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I helped to review the literature to date on air pollution impacts on birds and outlined some key knowledge gaps for future studies. And I'm really excited that this literature review has become a resource for decision makers and was actually recently cited in Indicators of Climate Change in California. We found that there is limited inference on the impacts of air pollution in wild, free-living birds and the sensitivity of responses to specific air pollutants. So we might have compared birds in a more and less polluted area, but that doesn't necessarily tell us which pollutant or at which concentration is causing any of the effects that we observe. We also need to do a lot more to characterize these dose-response relationships for vital rates, such as survival, growth, and reproduction. We need to know which air pollutants and at what concentrations are ultimately driving changes in these rates that determine whether populations grow or decline. It's also possible that birds exhibit behavioral responses to air pollution that represent coping strategies and allow them to survive and maybe even thrive in places that have a higher level of air pollution. We just don't know what those look like. Finally, we need to consider a much wider range of species and ecosystems because we've only just scratched the surface looking at specific species in very specific places, and there's a lot more to think about when it comes to air pollution impacts on birds around the world. One pollutant that I'm especially interested in is fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5. This includes all suspended liquid and solid particles that are smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter. And there are both biogenic or natural sources of this pollutant, such as windblown dust and wildfire smoke, and anthropogenic sources such as vehicle exhaust or industrial emissions. And PM 2.5 has already been well established as a major risk to public health. PM 2.5 contributes to cardiovascular and respiratory disease, cancer, and premature mortality. In fact, recent research has suggested that more than 4 million premature deaths around the world each year can be attributed to PM 2.5 pollution. Because PM 2.5 is a pollutant of global concern, there are many resources available to quantify exposure, including measurements from ground-based monitors and satellite instruments and air quality models, which means that we have access to a rich source of data for studies of wildlife. We can really develop valuable, meaningful exposure metrics for wildlife for this pollutant in particular. PM 2.5 is also very important because it's increasing in many parts of the US. Until recently, outdoor concentrations of PM 2.5 had actually been declining. Ever since Congress passed the Clean Air Act in 1970, we've seen rapid improvements of air quality, including reductions in PM 2.5 due to both increasingly stringent environmental regulations and technological advancements. People and wildlife were breathing cleaner and cleaner air every year. But in the last few years, our air quality has worsened and we've lost years of progress. As you can see from this plot showing the difference in PM 2.5 from one year to the next, in recent years, we've seen an increase in PM 2.5 pollution, more or less after 2016. Why is this? One major reason is that we've observed greater wildfire activity in the American West. Where there's fire, there's smoke, and as fires burn more frequently and ferociously, driven by climate change and a legacy of fire suppression, our communities and wildlife are increasingly exposed to dangerous smoke. And while public health implications of this increased smoke exposure is still an emerging area of research, recent findings have suggested that the PM 2.5 that's actually in smoke is potentially more toxic than PM 2.5 from urban and industrial sources. So we're seeing more PM 2.5 in the landscape, largely due to smoke. In the age of megafires, it's just clear that we have and will observe more extreme smoke events, and this will happen both in places that are used to fire and where smoke is just a totally novel occurrence. I don't have to tell folks on this call that smoke is a real problem in the Pacific Northwest. Many of the region's ecosystems are prone to fire, and across the American West, the places birds live and the lands that we all love have truly been shaped by fire. But as fire has intensified, so has smoke, and prevailing winds can carry smoke hundreds of miles away from the places where fires are burning. This is a satellite image taken on September 9th, 2020. The orange dots mark the locations of fire and other thermal anomalies throughout the American West. And we can see smoke billowing out from these fires, just inundating the West Coast and blowing hundreds of miles out to sea. And I think this photo really captures that smoke is not just a local disturbance related to a fire that is actively burning, but actually a regional and potentially even a global disturbance that can affect people and wildlife for hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles. This single smoke event, by the way, in 2020, has been linked to thousands of premature deaths in the state of California and Washington. Just to drive this point home, here are some pictures from local news outlets or pictures that I have taken of smoke events that folks have been experiencing out on the West Coast of the last few years. The top picture is one of the Los Angeles skyline during September of 2020, the bottom of the Seattle skyline in August 2018. And the plot at the right just shows the expected increase in the number of days of bad air quality that atmospheric scientists are projecting. If you compare the number of bad air quality days that folks experienced between 2006 and 2010 and 2016 and 2020, the number of bad days is just skyrocketing. And this is bad for people and it's bad for wildlife. So what do we know about how this increased smoke exposure could impact the health and behavior of birds? To help guide future study and conservation actions as part of my doctoral research at the University of Washington, I led a comprehensive literature review to identify and synthesize all the research to date on the effects of wildfire smoke on terrestrial wildlife, including birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and insects. And we found that research on this topic is surprisingly extremely limited, and most studies are observational, and few have applied rigorous statistics to explicitly test for an effect of smoke. So the picture here is pretty limited. We just don't know that much about what's going on. But we can ascertain a few things, and we are aided in this by the availability of case studies from veterinary medicine and poultry sciences that can help us start to fill in the blanks. We know that there are health effects linked to smoke inhalation in animals. They are both acute or short-term and chronic or long-term, and they may include carbon monoxide poisoning, thermal and chemical damage to lung tissue, oxidative stress, immunosuppression, and respiratory and cardiovascular illness. These myriad physiological effects are likely to play out in wild bird populations, even if we haven't directly observed them yet. Recently, I worked with a phenomenal undergraduate researcher, Ms. Anna Nihei, at the University of California, Los Angeles, who led a study published in Ornithology earlier this summer, looking at how repeated captures of birds at a banding station in Northern California told that what did that tell us about the health of the birds that we are capturing. And she found that the body mass of birds that were exposed to repeated or prolonged smoke events was quite a bit lower, which is the first evidence that we have that these health effects are taking place in wild birds as a result of exposure to wildfire smoke. And I can talk more about that study in the Q&A if folks have questions. In addition to these health effects, we're also observing a number of behavioral responses in birds, including reduced activity, fire avoidance or energy conserving behaviors, and pyrophilous behaviors or fire-loving behaviors. For example, there are insects that lay their eggs in fire-killed trees and are attracted to smoke for that reason. They use smoke to navigate toward these resources, and birds that feed on those insects may be observed in greater presence or abundance, taking advantage of all this influx of insects. A lot of these behavior responses are being observed and reported by birders in the community, or we have these one-off observations published in the literature, but there has been no in-depth analysis looking at these behavioral responses and how they play out in wild bird populations. So if we put all this together and we think about the literature that exists and the observations that are being reported by birders and theoretical relationships, we can consider a concept map that looks something like this. This is published in the review that I mentioned. And we can see how wildfire smoke is impacting the health and behavior of birds and how these these responses could ultimately scale up to population level or even ecosystem level impacts. This is the guide that I use for my research today. I was really lucky to be able to have the opportunity to work with a wonderful team of researchers at the University of Washington on this review, and then bring this foundational knowledge to the University of California, Los Angeles to drive the postdoctoral research that I'm leading in Dr. Morgan Tingley's lab. So let's think a little bit more about wildfire smoke and our own observations of birds. Really, studying impacts of wildfire smoke and other air pollutants on birds is just inherently challenging because the air quality can change so rapidly. This is a satellite image showing the air pollution, just a snapshot of what air pollution looked like from space each day for a week starting on September 5th, 2020. So capturing that smoke event that took place in 2020 that I mentioned earlier. And you can see that every day the smoke is impacting a different place with a different intensity, and forecasting this and anticipating smoke impacts in order to design the field studies that we could really benefit from to learn more about how birds are responding to smoke in real time is just hard. It's just hard to know where the smoke is going to go. And I really believe that the key to unraveling this mystery of smoke impacts on birds is public participation in science. By engaging volunteers in data collection, ornithologists can survey birds at regional scales that were once totally impossible, thereby facilitating studies of avian responses to rapid and often unpredictable changes in air pollution. So to test this idea, as part of my dissertation, I led an analysis of eBird data to learn more about how smoke has impacted our observations of birds in the past. So here's the setup. Wildfire smoke could lead to behavioral changes in birds. Maybe birds feel crummy and they change their behavior accordingly. Maybe birds encounter smoke and try to move to an area where the air pollution is less intense. Maybe birds hunker down and wait it out. We're not really sure what those behavioral changes will look like, but if birds are altering their behavior in any way in response to smoke, that will impact their presence and our ability to detect them on the landscape. And this means that our probability of observing birds on any given day will change in response to smoke. Now, our ability to detect birds when it's smoky is variable, both because birds might act differently and because we might feel different. I think most folks on this call have probably had a personal experience going outside on a smoky day. It's not fun. We feel gross. We can't breathe as well. The air smells funny. The sky looks weird. We might not be able to see as far. So our personal experience in a smoke event does also impact our ability to detect birds. So that's a piece here that we can't quite tease out. As part of this study, we used PM2.5, again, fine particulate matter, as a marker of wildfire smoke. And we tested whether PM2.5 was related to the probability of observing birds. So does the ability of birders to detect birds in the field change as a result of PM2.5 pollution as a marker of wildfire smoke? This is a map showing the locations of eBird checklists included in this analysis. We were able to include more than 62,000 checklists from nearly 5,000 observers across the state of Washington. These locations, the locations of these eBird checklists are marked as gray dots on the map, and the black triangles represent the locations of air quality monitors run by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, 71 in total, that we retrieved air pollution data from. Our goal was to determine how wildfire smoke influenced the probability of observing birds during the 2015 through 2018 fire seasons in Washington state. We know that we need to also consider how habitat can influence where birds occur and how likely we are to detect them. So to account for this, we included data on land cover from the National Land Cover Database. And we also accounted for weather, including the daily mean air temperature and the daily accumulated precipitation using data from the North American Regional Reanalysis. I'm going to breeze over these statistics. Again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to chat more and geek out about the cool math that we used in the Q&A. We were able to use the data from these eBird checklists to model the probability of observing 71 study species. And we used generalized linear mixed models with a binomial distribution to do this. And our response variable, this probability of observing a bird, represents both the probability of a bird being present and the probability that we're able to detect the bird given that it is there and available to be observed. So we aren't able to tease out specifically the probability that a bird is there or the probability that should it be there, we can observe it. But just in general, what is the probability that we will see this bird on this day, given that it's smoky? Our models accounted for PM 2.5, year, habitat, seasonality, daily temporal differences in bird activity, and weather patterns. And we also included a random effect of observer in our models in order to account for individual variation in ability to detect birds. In addition, we counted for survey effort. So every eBird checklist comes with information on the duration of a survey and the distance traveled. And as you can imagine, most of the time, if we're out surveying birds for longer or we walk further, then we are going to be more likely to observe birds. So it's important to account for that in our model as well. What we found is that PM 2.5 influenced the probability of observing 37% of our study species, which is a significant proportion. And this relationship was not always positive and not always negative. In fact, we found that the relationship was negative for 16 species and positive for 10. So 16 species were less likely to be observed on smoky days, and 10 species were more likely. And I believe that this is a really powerful result because this suggests that we cannot just explain what's happening here by impacts on human observers alone. There's no reason to think that if we as people go outside when it's smoky, we're going to somehow become better at observing birds. Birds must be changing their behavior in a way that makes them more present or more available or more likely to be detected if we're picking up on a positive relationship. It's not just that we feel crummy and we can't see as far. There's something else going on here. Here's a plot showing the predicted probability of observing birds related to the daily mean concentration of PM 2.5, which again, we're using as a marker of wildfire smoke for the species that we observed a negative relationship. And this list includes a wide range of species, including large water birds, birds of prey, and even some smaller songbirds. The mechanisms driving these relationships were beyond the scope of this study, but our results point to several interesting hypotheses. For example, some of these birds might have reduced their activity, possibly due to underlying health effects, which makes it less likely that we would observe them. Perhaps these larger bodied birds, maybe the red-tailed hawk or the osprey, these raptors and gulls that are known to use much bigger areas, and some of the smaller birds that were included in our analysis have a greater capacity to leave an area that is smoky and find cleaner skies. I also think that some of these larger birds are more likely spotted at a distance during our eBird surveys, and so we might observe a negative effect on their detection simply because our own visibility as birders is impaired. This is a plot showing that predicted probability of observing birds as a function of PM 2.5 for the species that were more likely to be observed when it was smoky. And this list includes a number of warblers and other small passerines. And intriguingly, I think these are birds that might become more active if some of those larger birds of prey actually did leave the area. But these are also birds that forage closer to the ground, which may have made them more visible to birders that had to focus their attention closer to the ground because their visibility was impaired. So there's a lot of interesting competing hypotheses in play here. But what we can see is that there is a difference in the bird observations that we make on smoky days. And that tells us that birds are changing their behavior in some way when it is hazy. Wildfire smoke is influencing the presence, availability, and/or perceptibility of birds, and this is likely explained at least in part by species-specific behavioral responses. And now we need to tease out these mechanisms driving the relationship between smoke and detectability. And to do this, we are launching Project Phoenix, investigating bird responses to smoke. So my dissertation helped to demonstrate the potential for community science to help us learn more about smoke impacts on birds. And building on this idea, last year, our team led a new community science monitoring program to intentionally start documenting birds during the fire and smoke season. We started just in California and recruited birds in that single state to pilot this program. And now we've expanded to include Washington and Oregon, which is very exciting. This program is a partnership between UCLA and the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. But although we are here based in California, we're really excited to include folks in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm especially excited to start thinking about birds in the PNW again, because that was such a big part of my doctoral experience. Last year, we engaged 304 volunteers from 175 zip codes in California, and this year we already have more than 400 volunteers signed up from all 3 states. So why is it that we can't just use existing eBird data? Why is it that we actually need to make this intentional effort? Well, most bird monitoring projects collect data in the spring and early summer to study birding populations during the breeding season, but fires tend to occur later in the year. And we really want to make sure that we encourage folks to go out and continue to document birds and tell us about their bird observations during a time of year that's just less popular for not only birding, but also monitoring bird populations. More importantly, to investigate the effects of smoke, we need data on bird observations in the same places, ideally at the same times of day, on the same days of the week throughout the fire season, and before, possibly during, and definitely after smoke events. So we need these repeated counts in places that folks are returning to time and time again during the fire season in order to evaluate these real-time responses to shifts in air quality. To my knowledge, this is one of the first studies that's intentionally designed to anticipate smoke impacts, which, as I mentioned earlier, is really hard to do. But if we cover enough ground across these 3 states, if we have folks out surveying birds every week, regardless of what the fire and smoke season looks like, we will be able to capture some smoke events, and that's really exciting. Finally, this study design also allows us to collect fine-scale habitat data that we wouldn't be able to get if we just relied on eBird data. We actually know our volunteers. We collect information about our volunteer demographics. We ask them to register their sites, and that means that we can collect data on habitat variables that there is no publicly available resource for, such as the availability of bird feeders and bird baths. This is exciting because one of the things that I'm most interested in is considering if the responses that birds have to smoke vary with resource availability, such as bird feeders and bird baths. So not only are we going to collect data on the presence and abundance of birds during the fire season in these 3 states and evaluate how wildfire smoke is affecting where birds occur on the landscape, but we're also going to think about if birds are using bird feeders and bird baths differently when it's smoky. So the hypothesis here is that wildfire smoke could be leading to underlying health effects in bird populations or smoke avoidance behaviors. And either way, that's going to cause birds to burn through a lot of calories. And that energy deficit may lead them to increase their use of feeders. They might be relying more on supplemental food provided by people. In addition, wildfire smoke might make birds thirsty, and it's definitely dirtying their feathers, which could prompt them to increase their need for water and therefore increase their use of bird baths. A lot of folks have written into me to let me know that they seem to observe birds using their bird baths more regularly when it's smoky, or that the birds that arrive seem really thirsty or really invested in preening, and it seems like the time that they spend at the feeder is greater. So we won't necessarily be able to think about the use of these specific resources at a given site, how long a particular species is using a feeder or a bird bath, for example. But if we know where our volunteers are conducting their weekly surveys and we know what resources are available at those sites, we can start to determine if birds are more or less likely to use locations with or without these resources. And that's exciting because it could tell us if these resources would be something valuable to provide to birds to help shepherd them through ever smokier fire seasons. So what are we asking folks to do? Volunteers choose their own monitoring sites, ideally someplace that is convenient and personally meaningful to them. And they conduct a weekly 10-minute point count of all the birds that they see and or hear at that location and submit these observations as a single eBird checklist. Folks are welcome to add to their data collection too if you'd like to do more than one survey a week, if you'd like to conduct surveys at multiple locations, or perhaps whenever you're out birding at a new site, you're welcome to do so. We just ask that you register all the sites that you are monitoring birds at and try to keep at least one of those sites consistently surveyed throughout the fire season, which we're defining as now through the end of November. We also know that participation in community science is often biased toward higher income and white communities. So to encourage broader participation and support more equitable outcomes, we're actively recruiting beginner birders. And I'm particularly excited about engaging folks from communities underrepresented in birding and community science. To support beginner birders, we are not only encouraging beginner birders to participate, but we're trying to help them get started. We provide lots of resources on our website to support beginner birders. We are available to birders Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, to answer any questions folks have about species identification. And we also host virtual office hours, and we try to hold in-person events too, although most of those are based in Southern California because that's where our team is. So perhaps we can work with our partners up in the Pacific Northwest to plan some in-person events in the future. So right now, the folks on this call are probably most likely to attend our virtual office hours. Ultimately, our work here at Project Phoenix has some exciting conservation relevance that I think will be exciting to folks at eBird Northwest and the Klamath Bird Observatory. What we can learn from Project Phoenix is whether birds stay, shift, or go when it's smoky. That's what I'm excited about. That's what folks want to know. What are birds doing when it's smoky? Are they hanging out where they are? Are they shifting their use of resources where they are? Or are they leaving altogether? And this will help us identify the places and resources that serve as smoke refugia and determine if different species respond differently to smoke, and if doing so actually helps them to mitigate their own exposure. Finally, we'll consider which different traits species have that might relate to these strategies. Can we predict which strategies birds would use based on their life history, or their size, or their diet, for example? In addition, we're hoping to learn whether birds change their use of bird feeders and or bird baths when it's smoky. And by characterizing shifts in bird activity during smoke events and thinking about how resource availability mediates these responses, we might be able to develop intervention strategies that are as simple as providing supplemental resources. That said, we might find that birds aren't changing their use of feeders or bird baths, and therefore we really want to invest our limited conservation dollars in protecting smoke refugia. So these are two options that we have for helping to support birds when it's smoky outside, making sure that the places that they need or the resources they need are available, and learning which option seems most promising is really important, because there just aren't that many conservation dollars going around to help birds right now. So how can you help? Well, first, you can sign up to volunteer. We are recruiting volunteers on a rolling basis from now through the end of November. You can sign up anytime and start your 10-minute weekly surveys. Our fabulous partners in the Pacific Northwest are helping us by promoting our program on their website, sharing our project on social media, and engaging their staff and members and volunteers in participating. If you work at an office building, maybe you could establish a monitoring site there and encourage your colleagues to conduct a weekly survey with you and make it a team building event. And if you are a manager, maybe you could encourage your staff to do this by allowing them to take a 10 to 15-minute break to go out and conduct their survey. Going outside is a great break for everyone. We should all be getting up from our desks more often. Why not go birding? Finally, what can we offer to you? Well, we can promote your organization's programs, events, and other initiatives. We'd be happy to. Our platforms reach tens of thousands of people. It could be a great opportunity to collaborate and make sure that the wonderful work you're doing is promoted and shared with a broader community of community scientists and birders. We can also conduct more meetings with your team or your membership just like this to share our science. We could dive into different research that we're working on wildfire smoke impacts on birds outside of Project Phoenix too. We don't just have to talk about this community science program. We also offer community workshops on birding and species identification. And one of my favorite things is to host events on diverse career pathways in STEM for youth groups. I think sometimes the journey to a PhD in science can be rather opaque. And there are also a lot of opportunities to engage in science that don't require a PhD, and helping students figure out these various ways to engage in birding and conservation as a career is really exciting. And so we've worked with many of our supporting organizations to offer events in which we meet with their young birders and talk about that. So with that, I would like to say thank you to my co-authors, mentors, community scientists everywhere, and all of my amazing students who contribute to these analyses. Anna Nihei should be on this slide as well. Sorry about that, Anna. And I want to acknowledge that I have received funding from the UCLA Institute of Digital Research and Education Postdoctoral Fellowship and the LaCroix Center for California Conservation Science. So if you have any questions about Project Phoenix or my research, I would be happy to take them now. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you so much, Olivia. That was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions? You can feel free to put them in the chat, or you can unmute.
I just want to make a comment. This is Lilia Caballero in Medford. One of the things that I saw on your one of your slides is September 9, 2020. And that's actually happened here with us, right? And September 8, 2020, that's when we actually had the horrible fire that destroyed 2,500 homes. And so all that smoke obviously went up somewhere. And so I just wanted to let you know, Olivia, that that picture is pretty close to the people here in the Rogue Valley.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
yeah. Okay, one thing that the reason I signed up, I told you that, Olivia, earlier, is because I didn't know the psychological effect of watching birds. Can you speak a little bit about that? It wasn't on your slides. I know you're talking about something different, but that's what I signed up. I wanted to know what
Yeah.
psychological benefit is.
That is a wonderful reason to sign up. I'm going to pull up a page on our website that folks can go to access some additional resources on this topic. I will go ahead and share that screen with you all. So if you would like to learn more about Project Phoenix, you can go to projectphoenix.study. We have a lot of different resources on our webpage, and one of them is on birding and mindfulness. There's a lot of really great research out there right now that suggests that birding supports our mental health and well-being. Birds connect us to nature, and bird song itself actually has been shown to restore our focus. And each of these links is to a different study that has established this really profound connection between birding and psychological health. And I believe that birding really just begins with intention. All birders start as beginners. So even if you've never been birding before, it's never too late to get started. And just by sitting outside and starting to pay attention to the birds around us, we will feel lighter, we will feel more at ease, and birding gets easier the more often that you do it. So my advice is to start by focusing on just one bird and note its behaviors and vocalizations, and then start soaking up the soundscape and tuning into different species that are calling and singing. And at some point, maybe it would be fun to go visit a place that you love that's personally meaningful to you, even if it's a place that you don't necessarily know has the richest diversity of birds, and start making a list of all the birds at that location. Bird lists are a great way to connect with the land around us. So absolutely, there are some really compelling reasons to participate in Project Phoenix and community science in general, and submit our observations to eBird. It's not just good for science and good for the birds, it's also good for us.
Thank you, Olivia. Somebody was wondering if you would be able to share your presentation as well. So I'll be sharing out the recording with anyone who's registered, and it will be also going out on the eBird Northwest website and through the KBO call note. So if you're signed up for any of those, you will get the presentation, which you could share out. It'll be hosted on YouTube. But I don't know if Olivia, if you'd be interested in sharing your presentation as well.
Yeah, I can share my presentation. I can share the slides. I think it might be a little overwhelming because I have a lot of notes and statistics. I use it as a resource for thinking about other studies that I have coming up. I just start jotting down notes to myself, so it's a little messy. So I might either need to parse some of that out so that it's just the slides and not any of my notes, or I could make a simple version to share with partners and folks who are interested in sharing, just so that it's a little less overwhelming.
Okay.
I don't know. I guess I'm a pain in the butt, but can you include the benefit, the psychological benefit, so we can say, okay, I want to be a volunteer because this is going to help
Yes,
me,
here.
not only the birds, but I think it's important, in the era that we live, to know about resources that are free, they're out there that we can just enjoy as any person. And I think, I don't know, Elba, but I think it will be nice.
Absolutely. I created a flyer on the mental health benefits of birds that you could absolutely share with
Yeah.
everybody here.
Yeah.
Can I add files to Zoom? Oh, I can. Cool. Okay.
Yeah, I think
Here
there's
it
a
is.
file button. Yeah.
Free resource for everybody on birding as mindfulness. So if you click on that and open it up, this is a flyer that I made for an event on campus last spring, Birding for Peace of Mind. Birding supports our mental health and well-being, and lists some of these connections. Unfortunately, because it is a PDF that we planned to print, it doesn't have links to the studies in it, but that resource on our website that I linked to in the chat, that does have the link. So very similar content, but the flyer is like ready to go and you can share it like right now.
And there's a lot of great resources. If you just Google like birding for mindfulness, there's like a whole mindfulness organization focused on birding and meditation that they do like monthly webinars and meetups online or in person. And it's a very growing thing is birding as meditation.
Birding is meditation. It's the
Yeah.
best type there is. I don't know about anybody else on this call, but I find yoga very boring at times, and I cannot sit and do like the whole like minute of silence thing. My brain just does not quiet down for that. So, but birding works to clear my mind and feel connected in a way that like no other type of meditation has. So definitely worth trying if you are a beginner birder.
Well, I like the 10-minute.
Yeah.
Pretty quick.
Everybody can do it for 10 minutes. That's the goal, right? Is like try for 10 minutes.
One more question. Why am I the only one asking questions for God's sake? Don't you guys, do you know everything yet?
I appreciate it. Thank you for asking questions.
So when I never done bird breeding, just sit on the outside of my house in the back porch and watch the birds. But is there special tools or equipment that you need, or just your person?
That is a good question. Just your person. Sure, if you have binoculars, go ahead and use them. If you would like to use the Merlin Bird ID app, you're more than welcome to. We have some resources on our website about how to use the Merlin Bird ID app. For those not familiar, Merlin Bird ID is a mobile application that can help you identify birds in the field, either by sight or by sound. By sight, all you have to do is answer 5 questions about the bird, and then it will pull in the most likely options for the bird that you're seeing based on how you answered those questions and recent observations of birds in your area from eBird. And then you can also document the soundscape. You can actually make a recording of the acoustic environment, and Merlin will automatically detect birds that are calling and singing. Caveat, it's not always right. So we have some notes on our website about how to use that data and those helpful tips in a smart way, that it's more like a guide than a definite, yes, I heard this bird. So you can read more about that on our website. We also have linked to some how-to documents for using those. That said, you don't have to do that, right? Like you don't need binoculars, you don't need to have the app. You also don't even need to have a mobile device. If you want to just go out and do your 10-minute survey and use pen and paper and be old-fashioned and be off your phone, love that. Totally support that. You can go online later and upload your observations just like when you get back to your laptop or your phone. You don't have to bring it with you. I think it's a little easier to make eBird checklists using the mobile app personally, but I've done it the other way too. Totally works. I'm seeing some other comments here. Serena is asking about a keynote speaker for an annual fundraiser on October 5th. I know of some researchers who work at OSU who might be able to participate as keynote speakers and talk about Project Phoenix. I have some collaborators there who are working on some really exciting research, including Dr. Jamie Cornelius, who is looking at tracking robins and seeing where they go when it's smoky, and then also collecting birds at mist netting stations and evaluating their health before, during, and after smoke events. She is not part of the Project Phoenix team, but I'm sure would be happy to talk about this community science project in the context of her other work. So if you would like to email me, I'll put my email in the chat. I could connect you with Jamie, and she or one of her other colleagues might be able to help you out. Otherwise, I'd be happy to give a virtual talk to your organization if you're open to that. I have a 6-month-old baby, so I cannot travel right now. He's new, and I just got back to work like 2 weeks ago, so it's not possible for me to travel quite yet, but I'd be happy to give a virtual talk. And then someone asked about Salem, same deal. So happy to give a virtual talk, but also happy to connect you with some really amazing folks in Oregon who could speak more to their personal experiences. I gave a talk for the Sun River Nature Center and Observatory last summer on this topic. And there were definitely lots of folks throughout Oregon who were really excited to to think about ways they could help birds. So I know there's a big community of people